remember the morning I met Elliot because he spoke my name before I had the chance to even look at him. "Richard, don't speak yet," he said, standing in the thin winter mist outside the community building. His voice was calm but urgent, like someone trying to steady a shaking glass. I had never seen him before, but he knew details I hadn't told anyone in years: where I kept the spare key for the basement, the scar on my right hand, the old watch I wore even though it no longer ticked. I should have walked away, but something in the way he said my name made me freeze. He told me he was from the future, not as a boast, not with any dramatic flair, just a quiet fact laid in front of me, like he was tired of carrying it alone. And when he predicted a small event that happened minutes later, a light inside the building flickering out at the exact moment he said it would, I felt something unfamiliar stir in me. Trust. He didn't smile when I reacted. He only repeated the line that stayed with me for the rest of the day. "What matters isn't who I am. It's what's about to happen to you." He said someone would blame me for something I didn't cause, something small but damaging, something that would follow me for years if I didn't listen. Then he leaned closer, lowering his voice until it sounded like he was telling me a secret meant for only one pair of ears. "Don't give the basement key to anyone today. Not a single person. If you do, everything changes." I didn't know what everything meant, but I believed him. For a moment, I felt grateful, like I'd been given a quiet warning from someone who actually cared about what happened to me. His tone wasn't threatening. It sounded more like regret, as if he'd already watched the day play out 100 different ways. But standing there in the muted cold, I didn't know the truth yet. I didn't know his advice wasn't meant to protect me. It was meant to hide him. I didn't tell anyone about Elliot that morning. It felt too strange, too personal, like repeating his words out loud would make them sound impossible. So I walked into the community building the same way I always did, shaking the thin layer of frost off my coat and heading toward the maintenance room. I tried to convince myself that I'd misread everything he said, that I'd let the cold and the early hour get into my head. But his voice kept replaying, "Don't give the basement key to anyone today." It followed me like a shadow across the hallways. Days at the building usually began with small routines, checking the boiler gauges, turning on lights, making sure the storage rooms were locked. Laura, who handled the morning desk, waved at me from the lobby. She said the heating vents were making noise again and asked if I could look into it later. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious, but I caught myself glancing at the keyring on my belt every few minutes, feeling its weight as if someone might try to take it at any moment. The more I replayed Elliot's warning, the more it settled under my skin. It wasn't just the words, it was the certainty behind them. He hadn't tried to frighten me. He'd spoken like someone who had already watched me make the wrong choice. That quiet confidence made me believe him more than the predictions he'd proven. Around mid-morning, a faint uneasiness crept in. I noticed small things I'd never paid attention to before. Laura's hurried footsteps, the way the old door hinges in the hallway hissed when air moved through them, the dim hum of the boiler beneath the floorboards. Nothing looked out of place, but everything felt slightly shifted, like the day had been nudged off its original track. At the time, I thought Elliot was helping me avoid a mistake. I didn't realize he was arranging the day so that the mistake would belong to me alone. "Hi, my name is Richard. If you're enjoying the story so far, I'd be grateful if you subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know. Have you ever felt like someone gave you a warning that changed the way you looked at an ordinary day? Thank you to everyone who's been here supporting these stories. Now, let's get back to the story." I spent the first hour of the morning pretending nothing was different. But the truth was that Elliot's voice kept slipping back into my thoughts. It felt like it was hiding behind every sound in that old building, behind the radiator clank, the quiet echo in the stairwell, the fluorescent buzz that always came back in winter. I'd worked there long enough to ignore those things, but that day each noise seemed sharper, clearer, as if the building itself knew something I didn't. I was tightening a loose vent plate in the hallway when Laura stepped toward me, rubbing her hands together to warm them. "Richard, did you get a chance to check the basement?" she asked. "It feels colder than usual down here." I hesitated. Not because the basement was a problem. The basement was always a problem. But because her question brushed up against the thought I'd been trying to avoid. The key on my belt felt heavier than the screwdriver in my hand. "I'll get to it after I finish upstairs," I said. Laura nodded and walked away, but I caught her glancing back twice. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she just wanted the heating issue fixed. But Elliot's warning had changed the way I read every small gesture, every shift in tone. He had placed a filter over the day, and I didn't know how to take it off. I moved to the storage closet next, sorting boxes and checking labels. The routine usually settled my mind, but that morning it made me feel cornered. Every door I opened reminded me of the one door I wasn't supposed to unlock. Every key I touched reminded me of the one I was supposed to keep to myself. The longer I held that rule in my head, the more I felt like I was tampering with something delicate, like I was balancing the day on the tip of a pin. Around 10:30, I heard footsteps behind me. Soft ones, hesitant. When I turned, Laura was standing there with a clipboard pressed to her chest. "Richard," she said, clearing her throat, I need to get into the basement storage. There's a box Brian asked me to bring up." It felt like someone had pressed a cold hand to my spine. I heard Elliot's words again. "Don't give the basement key to anyone today. Not a single person." His tone had been too steady, too certain. And now Laura, someone I'd never had a single issue with, was asking for the one thing I'd promised to withhold. I tried to keep my voice steady. "What does he need?" She blinked. "Just some old event folders. He said you wouldn't mind." Normally, she'd be right. I never minded. I'd handed Laura that key 100 times without thinking twice. But standing there, with that thin clipboard between us and the hallway stretching out so quiet behind her, I felt myself step back slightly. "Can it wait until after lunch?" I asked. She frowned. Not annoyed, just confused. "It'll only take a second. I know exactly where the box is." I swallowed. I could feel Elliot tightening his grip on my mind, even though he wasn't there. The choice didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like I was following instructions in a script written by someone else. "I'm just checking a few things down there," I lied. "Let me finish first." It was the first lie I'd told her in the 8 years we'd worked together. Her eyebrows lifted just a little, like she recognized something was off. She held the clipboard tighter. "Richard, is everything okay?" I should have said yes. I should have handed her the key. I should have trusted the day to unfold the way it always did. But Elliot had planted something in me. Fear disguised as protection. Certainty disguised as trust. And because he had been right about everything so far, I believed him more than I believed myself. "I'll bring the box up when I'm done," I said. Laura hesitated for a long second. Then she nodded and walked away, slower than usual. The hallway swallowed her footsteps one by one, each softer than the last. I stood there alone, hand resting over the key, the lie settling like dust in my throat. And for the first time that morning, I felt the faint, unmistakable pull of guilt, like I'd already done something wrong, even though I'd only followed a warning I never asked for. I tried to get back to my tasks, but the lie I'd told Laura clung to me like a smell that wouldn't wash off. I walked through the hallway holding my tool bag, pretending to focus on the loose fixtures and the uneven floor tiles. But every step felt slightly heavier than the last. I kept thinking about how she looked at me, confused, maybe a little hurt. And even though Elliot wasn't anywhere near the building, I felt his presence like a weight pressing behind my ribs. I found myself standing in front of the basement door without remembering the walk there. The metal handle was cold under my glove, and the key felt heavier than the lock itself. I unlocked the door and stepped down into the dim stairwell. The basement always carried a slight smell of dust and old cardboard, but today it felt thicker, as if the air had been waiting for me. I turned on the lights and they flickered, snapping the shadows into place. I walked past the storage shelves, pretending I knew what I was looking for. Really, I just needed time. Time to understand why Elliot insisted on this. I knelt beside an old box of discarded maintenance logs, flipping through the yellowed pages. None of it mattered. Not today. I set the folder aside and pressed my hands against my knees, trying to breathe steadily. That was when I heard footsteps at the top of the stairs. Soft, hesitant, like someone trying not to disturb me, but also trying not to be caught. For a moment, I thought it was Laura again, maybe coming to ask why I was acting strange. But the footsteps stopped too quickly. There was a brief pause, and then the faint creak of the door's hinges shifting, as if someone had leaned in just enough to listen. "Hello?" I called out, louder than I intended. No answer, only the distant hum of the boiler. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step echoing into the concrete hallway. When I reached the top, the door was open just an inch, just enough for someone to have peeked through before leaving. I stepped into the hallway, but it was empty. I felt a shiver run down my spine. It didn't feel like one of the staff. It felt like someone checking whether the basement was free, whether I was out of the way. I locked the door behind me and stood there for a moment, thinking about Elliot's warning again. He hadn't told me what would happen if I ignored him. He hadn't said anything about why I shouldn't let anyone inside. He only said that if I did, everything would shift, and not in my favor. I headed toward the boiler room to check the pressure gauges, hoping the routine would calm me. But even there, the quiet felt wrong. The boiler normally thumped in a steady rhythm, but today the sound seemed uneven, like it missed a beat every few minutes. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I was reading too much into everything. But the more I tried to ground myself, the more the day felt out of focus. Laura found me around noon. She was holding a stack of papers, but her eyes were searching my face. "Hey, are you feeling all right?" she asked. "You seem a little off." I forced a small smile. "Just tired, didn't sleep great." She nodded, but didn't look convinced. "If you need help with anything today, just let me know." It was a simple offer, the kind she'd made countless times, but with Elliot's warning echoing in my thoughts, even her kindness felt like a test. I told her I was fine, and she walked away again. When she disappeared around the corner, I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes. It struck me that Elliot hadn't just predicted things. He'd planned them. He'd known when to approach me. He'd known the moment the lights would flicker. He'd known enough about my life to disarm me, to make me believe him. And now, even without being near me, he was guiding the shape of my day. Every choice I made felt less like my own and more like the next step in a direction he'd already mapped out. I didn't know what he wanted, but I knew this. Someone else had tried to get into the basement while I was there, and that meant Elliot wasn't warning me for my sake. He was moving pieces into place, pieces that started with a key and ended with me holding the blame. After lunch, the building grew quiet in the way it always did around early afternoon. Most people were in their offices or at meetings, and the hallways took on that muted stillness that made the place feel older than it was. Normally, I liked that part of the day, but now the silence felt like something waiting. I walked through the east corridor with my tool bag, pretending to follow the list of small repairs Brian had left, but it was impossible to focus on any of it. Every time my hand brushed the ring of keys at my waist, a ripple of unease ran through me. Elliot hadn't just planted fear, he'd planted expectation. I felt like something would happen simply because he had said it would. Halfway down the hallway, I heard voices coming from the lobby. Laura's voice, unmistakable. And another, lower, unfamiliar, careful. I stopped before turning the corner, listening. Laura sounded polite but uneasy, the way she did when talking to someone who didn't give clear answers. "Sir, if you're looking for maintenance, Richard is usually in the West Wing around this time," she said. A pause. Then the stranger, "No, that's all right. I'll find him." My stomach tightened. I stepped back, closer to the wall, keeping myself hidden from view. Footsteps approached. Slow, controlled, confident. When the man turned the corner, I recognized him instantly. Elliot. His coat was different from the one he wore that morning, but everything else, the way he carried himself, the way his eyes scanned the hallway, was exactly the same. He shouldn't have been there. His expression didn't change when he spotted me. It was as if he already knew where I would be standing, which direction I'd be facing, the exact second I'd lift my eyes to meet his. He walked toward me without hesitation. "Richard," he said quietly, "you should have stayed near the basement." My breath caught. "Why?" I asked. "What's going on? Why are you even here?" Elliot glanced back toward the lobby, then motioned for me to move closer to the stairwell. When we were out of sight, he lowered his voice. "Someone is going to ask you again for the basement key. Don't give it to them. Not under any circumstances." I shook my head. "Laura already asked." I told her no. His face sharpened, like he hadn't expected that. "Good. That was important. I'm not going to keep lying to her all day," I said. "She thinks something's wrong with me." Elliot stepped in just slightly, close enough that I could smell the cold on his coat. "Trust me, you don't want to know what happens if you give that key away. I've seen the consequences." There it was again, certainty. He spoke with the same calmness he had that morning, as if he were reading from a script he'd memorized long ago. But something in his face had shifted. He wasn't anxious. He wasn't afraid. He was watchful, focused, like he was waiting for something to fall exactly into place. I swallowed. You keep talking about consequences, but you won't tell me what they are. He didn't answer at first. His eyes moved past me toward the shadowed hallway behind us. Then he said, "Sometimes the explanation causes more harm than the event." It sounded like wisdom, but it wasn't an answer. It was just vague enough to keep me dependent on him. I stepped back. "I need to know the truth, Elliot. You owe me that." His jaw tightened. "I don't owe you anything. I'm trying to stop something that will ruin you." The words hit harder than they should have. Not because they frightened me, but because they sounded rehearsed. For the first time, I felt something cold slip into the space between us. A doubt I couldn't name yet. Elliot glanced at the far end of the hallway again. "Stay away from anyone asking about the basement, and don't leave this wing for the next 15 minutes. "What happens in 15 minutes? He didn't answer. He turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner with the same quiet certainty he'd arrived with. I stood there alone, my pulse drumming in my ears. 15 minutes. A warning with no explanation. A threat disguised as concern. And for the first time since morning, I wondered if Elliot wasn't trying to save me from consequences, but was arranging them, waiting for the moment everything would fall on me, exactly like he said it would. I stayed in the West Wing longer than I needed to. Elliot's warning about the next 15 minutes echoed in my head like a clock ticking somewhere I couldn't see. I walked slowly, pretending to inspect vents and emergency lights, but really I was watching the hallway corners, listening for footsteps, waiting for something, anything that would tell me what he was trying to steer me away from. Nothing happened. No sudden noise. No raised voices. No sign of trouble. If anything, the building felt softer than usual, like it was holding its breath. The quiet didn't help. It made me feel like I was bracing for something invisible. At the 16-minute mark, I let out a shaky breath. Part of me felt relieved, but the relief didn't settle. It slid away quickly, replaced by a heavier unease. Elliot hadn't been wrong about anything yet. Maybe whatever he predicted didn't happen because I listened. Maybe he was genuinely trying to protect me. Or maybe he was keeping me in one wing so someone else could move freely in another. That thought sat in my chest like a weight. I made my way back toward the lobby. Laura was sorting folders behind the desk. Her brow slightly creased the way it always was when she was concentrating. She looked up when she heard my footsteps. "There you are," she said. "Brian came by earlier. He was looking for you." My stomach tightened. "What for?" He didn't say. Just asked if I'd seen you. I forced a nod. "I'll find him." But I didn't move right away. I stood there for a moment, watching Laura organize papers, flipping through pages without noticing how tense I was. I wondered if she had any idea how strange the day had become for me. Probably not. Why would she? To her, I was just acting off, distracted, maybe even unreliable. "Richard?" she asked gently. "You sure everything's okay?" I hesitated again. I could have told her something, anything, to ease the worry in her voice. But Elliot had loaded my head with so many warnings that even the truth felt like something dangerous to share. "I'm fine," I said. "Just dealing with a few things." She didn't press. She just nodded slowly and returned to her papers. But I saw the doubt in her eyes before she looked down, and I hated how quickly I'd become someone she had to doubt. I turned toward the north hallway, heading for Brian's office. The air felt cooler there, the old heating vents working harder to push warm air through. When I reached the office door, it was slightly ajar. I knocked. No answer. I pushed the door fully open, expecting to find him finishing lunch or sorting schedules. But the office was empty. Lights off. Chair pulled back from the desk. A jacket hanging on the wall hook, spilling one sleeve down as if someone had grabbed it in a hurry and then changed their mind. Something about the room felt disturbed. Not messy, just subtly shifted. Papers on the desk weren't stacked evenly. A drawer wasn't closed all the way. A mug that was normally turned handle out was pointed to the side. Small details, barely noticeable, but all together they left an impression. Someone had been here recently, and someone else might have followed after. I stepped inside slowly, scanning the room. That was when I noticed the basement requisition form lying near the edge of the desk. It wasn't filled out, just blank lines and the bold header, "Storage access request." I ran my thumb along the page. Normally this form wasn't touched unless staff needed to record who entered the basement and why. But today, someone had started to pull the sheet out of the stack. Why? I turned toward the door again, suddenly aware of how quiet the hallway had become. Too quiet. I stepped out of the office and listened. Then I heard it, far down the corridor, faint but unmistakable. The sound of the basement door rattling, not opening, not slamming, just rattling, like someone was trying the handle gently, testing if it would give. My heartbeat quickened. Someone was trying to get in again. I didn't know who, I didn't know why, but I knew this. Elliot's warnings weren't about protecting me. They were about keeping that door closed, until it was my fault that it stayed that way. I walked quickly down the hallway, trying to quiet my footsteps so whoever was testing the basement door wouldn't hear me approaching. The building's acoustics were strange in the afternoons. Sounds carried too far in some corners, and not far enough in others. As I got closer, the rattling stopped. Silence settled between the walls like a thin sheet of ice. When I rounded the final bend, the basement door came into view. No one was there. Just the beige paint, chipped near the handle, and the brass plate that had dulled from decades of hands touching it. The keyhole gleamed faintly under the weak overhead light. I stood still, listening. Nothing. I reached out and rested my fingers on the door handle. It was warm, not from the building's heat. No, it was too specific for that. It felt like someone had just been gripping it moments before. My pulse kicked up and a faint tremor moved through my fingers. "Hello?" I called softly, not wanting the sound to travel too far. "Is someone there?" My voice came back to me in a thin echo. No answer. I knelt down and checked the bottom of the door. The thin layer of dust on the floor had a single faint streak, as if a shoe had brushed it while someone leaned in close. Someone had been here. Someone who knew how to leave almost no trace. I straightened up, trying to steady my breathing. Why this door? Why today? Why so quietly? It didn't feel like ordinary staff checking for storage access. It felt intentional, almost calculated. And Elliot's warnings, they were starting to feel less like predictions and more like placement, as if he were arranging me in the exact spot he needed me to be. I stepped back from the door and forced myself to think clearly. If someone wanted to get into the basement, they would likely try again. The building wasn't big. Whoever it was had to be nearby. I walked toward the north stairwell and looked down the steps, empty. I checked the east wing next, also quiet. When I reached the small lounge area near the vending machines, I finally saw movement, a figure leaning slightly against the wall, half hidden by the doorway. For a split second, I thought it was Elliot again, but when the person shifted, I saw that it was Laura. She startled when she noticed me. "Oh, Richard, I didn't hear you coming." She had a bundle of papers in her arms, but her posture was wrong, too tense, shoulders too tight, like she'd been listening for something instead of organizing files. "You okay?" I asked. She nodded quickly, almost too quickly. "Yeah, just looking for Brian. He asked me to bring these to him earlier, but I can't find him anywhere." I watched her closely. Her tone seemed normal, but there was a flicker of unease beneath it, something she wasn't saying. "You weren't just at the basement door, were you?" I asked. Her eyebrows rose. "No. Why?" "Someone was there a minute ago." Laura shifted the papers in her arms. "Maybe Brian? He mentioned needing to check the inventory list this morning." I nodded, but the explanation felt thin. Brian usually announced himself louder than anyone in the building. He didn't do things quietly, especially not checking doors. Laura glanced past me toward the hallway that led back to the basement. "Do you want me to help look for whoever it was?" Her offer was sincere. She wasn't trying to hide anything, at least not from what I could see. But Elliot's voice came back again, unwanted. "Stay away from anyone asking about the basement." I hated how quickly that warning affected me. I hated how much power Elliot's words had over perfectly normal moments. I forced myself not to sound suspicious. "It's fine," I said. "Probably nothing." Laura studied my face for a moment longer than usual, then pressed her lips together. "All right, if you're sure." I nodded again, though I wasn't. She left down the opposite hallway, papers rustling softly in her hands. I watched her go, feeling that now familiar tug of guilt. I'd pushed her away again without meaning to. When she disappeared around the corner, the hallway felt suddenly colder. I turned back toward the basement door. Whoever had tried the handle was quiet, careful, intentional, and deep down, I felt it. This wasn't someone looking for storage. This was someone looking for an opportunity. and Elliot was making sure that opportunity would land on me. I stayed near the basement door longer than I meant to, letting the quiet sink into my nerves. The building felt strange, like every sound had been softened, every corner dimmed. It reminded me of the way the world feels right before a storm, when the air holds its breath and waits. I kept telling myself I was imagining things, that Elliot's influence had twisted the day into something it wasn't. But the longer I stood there, the more certain I became that the silence meant someone was still nearby. I moved down the hallway slowly, checking each door without opening them. Most rooms were empty, just quiet offices and storage spaces filled with dust and the smell of old paper. Near the end of the corridor, I heard something faint, a soft thud like a box being set down gently. Then the rustle of cardboard shifting. I held my breath and stepped closer. The sound stopped immediately, as if whoever was inside had frozen. I waited. Still nothing. I placed my hand on the doorframe, listening. The room behind it was one of the smaller storage areas, rarely used except for community event leftovers. Normally the door was left open, but today it was pulled nearly shut. I pushed it open an inch. "Hello?" I asked quietly. The room was dim, lit only by a flickering bulb. A few folding chairs leaned against the back wall, and stacks of unused pamphlets sat on a metal shelf. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance, but something felt off. The air held a faint warmth, like someone had been standing close to the door just moments before. I stepped inside and scanned the floor. A small scuff mark dragged across the concrete, fresh enough that the dust hadn't settled over it. It led toward the back corner, but the trail ended abruptly, as if the person had turned back the moment they heard me. I swallowed, suddenly aware of how alone I felt. I stepped out and closed the door gently. Whoever that was, they were moving through the building quietly, checking spaces I never would have thought twice about. Not breaking in, not forcing anything, just searching. For what? I felt a chill crawl through my arms. Elliot had warned me about giving the key to anyone, but the building didn't feel like it was full of people trying to slip past me. It felt like someone was trying to confirm where I wasn't, like they needed to avoid me, not confront me. And the only person who'd shown up unexpectedly today was Elliot himself. I walked back toward the main intersection of the hallways and paused. There were faint footprints on the polished linoleum, nothing unusual on their own, but the pattern caught my eye. They were slightly wetter than they should have been, as if someone had come in from outside, but I hadn't heard the main doors open. They led toward the west wing, then doubled back toward the basement. Elliot had told me to stay in the west wing earlier, to stay away from this exact area. I suddenly wondered if that warning had been to keep me safe, or to keep me out of his way. My thoughts spiraled until a voice broke through them. "Richard?" I turned. Laura stood at the corner of the hallway holding a stack of envelopes. Her expression softened when she saw my face. "I've been looking for you. You didn't answer when I called earlier." "I didn't hear you," I said, forcing calm into my voice. "You sure you're all right?" she asked again. "You're different today." Something tightened in my throat. She wasn't wrong. I felt stretched thin, pulled between what I understood and what Elliot insisted I didn't need to, and yet I didn't want to pull her into it. "I'm managing," I said. She hesitated. "If there's something going on, you can tell me." I wished I could. I wished I could explain that a stranger from the future had cornered me before sunrise, told me things he shouldn't know, and was now orchestrating the day like pieces on a board. But it would sound unhinged. And even if she believed me, what then? She stepped closer and lowered her voice. "Brian still hasn't shown up, and now 2 people said they heard something in the basement hallway. I don't like it." Neither did I. But before I could say anything, a faint noise cut down the hallway. A soft click. The basement door unlocking. Except I had the key. Laura's eyes widened just as mine did. Someone was inside. And Elliot's warning suddenly felt less like protection and more like the cover someone needed. The sound of the basement lock clicking open shouldn't have been possible, not while the key was on my belt. I froze. Laura did too. For a long second, neither of us moved. The hallway behind us felt too still, like the air had thickened around our ears. My first instinct was to reach for the key, as if touching it would somehow undo what we'd heard. It can't be unlocked," I whispered. Laura's voice was barely audible. "Richard, someone's down there." She wasn't accusing me, not yet, but the seed of suspicion flickered in her eyes. Small, uncertain, but growing. I felt it land on me, heavy as a hand on my shoulder. Elliot had warned me that everyone would turn against me. I hadn't understood what he meant. Now, for the first time, I saw the shape of it. "Stay here," I said softly. "Richard," I cut her off gently. "Please." I stepped toward the basement door, each footfall echoing too loudly on the polished floor. The hallway lights hummed above me, that low winter buzz that always came back around December. But today the sound felt sharper, like it was urging me on. When I reached the door, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The lock had been turned from the inside. Someone had closed themselves in. I pressed my ear to the door. Nothing. No movement, no voices, no shifting boxes. Just stillness. "Whoever's in there," I called quietly. "You're not supposed to be." Silence answered. I turned the key in the lock. This time, it did move, and opened the door slowly. A draft slid up the stairwell, carrying the cold smell of concrete and old air. The light switch was still on. The staircase glowed faintly, yellow and dim. I took a step down. Nothing unusual yet, just the familiar creak of the steps under my weight. But when I reached the bottom, a detail snapped into place. One of the storage shelves had a small metal box pulled halfway out, much farther than when I'd last seen it. Its lid was slightly open. Inside, I could see papers, a few folders, items we used for community events. But someone had rifled through them. Not chaotically, carefully, precisely. I crouched down and brushed a fingertip across the shelf. The thin layer of dust had a streak through it, a fresh one. Someone had been here recently, too recently. Then I noticed something on the floor, a small indentation in the dust, the shape of a shoe print, not deep, just enough to show where someone had paused, maybe to listen, maybe to decide whether to run. My pulse hammered. Elliot, because who else would move through the building this quietly? Who else would know how to slip past me? Who else had used warnings and fear to position me exactly where he wanted? I stood up slowly, scanning the room. If he was still down here, he was hiding well. But more likely, he had slipped out while Laura and I stood frozen in the hallway. I checked the other shelves, each one meticulous and untouched, except for one drawer near the back. It hung open an inch. I approached cautiously and nudged it wider. Inside, where envelopes and sign-in sheets were usually kept, there was a small empty space, a rectangular gap where something had been, something that shouldn't be missing, something someone would notice before the day ended. And I was the only one who had been seen going in or out. I stepped back, my breath unsteady. "Richard?" Laura's voice drifted down the stairs. "Are you okay?" I swallowed hard. "There's something wrong down here." She came halfway down the steps, worry tightening her face. "Did you find anyone?" "No," which was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. She looked around the room, scanning the drawers, the shelves, the scattered dust. Then her eyes landed on the disturbed box. "Were you looking through that?" I hesitated. Too long. "Richard?" "No," I said. It wasn't me. Her gaze sharpened slightly, confusion mixing with something else, something she didn't want to say yet. I saw it happen in real time, the beginning of doubt, quiet but unmistakable. Elliot had told me people would turn against me, and now, for the first time, it felt close enough to touch. Laura stepped back, her expression unsettled. "I think we should talk to Brian," she said. "Something doesn't feel right." She didn't know how right she was. But if Elliot had taken something, if he had used the basement as cover, then Brian wouldn't be able to help. Elliot had manipulated the day from the start. The only question now was, what had he stolen? And how long until the blame fell on me exactly the way he'd promised? Laura and I walked back up the basement stairs in uneasy silence. She kept glancing over her shoulder, as if the quiet below us might suddenly turn into something else. When we reached the hallway, she let out a slow breath. The kind people release only when they've stepped out of some place they didn't want to be in the first place. "Let's find Brian," she said. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the tension underneath. It wasn't fear, it was concern. And concern could shift into suspicion if I wasn't careful. We headed toward his office again, passing rows of framed community posters and donation plaques. Normally they brightened the hallway, but today everything felt dull and slightly off, as if the colors had faded overnight. Or maybe it was just the way my thoughts were spiraling. When we reached the office, the door was still open a crack. Laura tapped it lightly. "Brian, you in there?" No answer. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. I followed, my eyes scanning the room again. That strange, disorganized feeling hadn't changed. Something about the space still felt unsettled, like someone had been through it quickly but carefully, someone who knew what they were looking for. Laura approached the desk and placed her folders down. "He wouldn't just leave all this mid-shift," she muttered. She opened the top drawer, then froze. "Richard, did you move anything in here earlier?" "No," I said, my stomach tightening. Because even from where I stood, I could see what she had noticed. Another gap in the drawer's contents. A rectangular outline where dust had formed around an object that wasn't there anymore. "Maybe he took it with him," I said, knowing how weak it sounded. Laura shook her head. "No, he's meticulous. If he'd signed anything out or moved paperwork, he would have logged it." She pointed at the logbook on the desk. The last entry was from yesterday. I felt the weight of her gaze on me again. It wasn't accusation, not yet, but it was doubt. Real doubt. The kind Elliot had promised would come. A faint knock echoed from the hallway. Laura and I turned sharply. It came again. 3 soft taps, spaced evenly. Not urgent, almost polite. We stepped out of the office and looked down the corridor. A man was standing near the end of the hall, hands in his coat pockets, posture calm. Elliot. He didn't move, didn't call out, didn't acknowledge us. He just waited, as if we were the ones who had been looking for him all along. Laura whispered, "Who is that?" For a moment I couldn't speak. The question lodged in my throat. Because what was I supposed to say? Someone who claims he's from the future. Someone who warned me not to give a key away. Someone who knows more than he should and less than he admits. Someone who's rearranging the day piece by piece while I stand here trying to pretend I'm still in control. I forced out, "Just someone who stopped me this morning." She blinked. "Stopped you from what?" Before I could answer, Elliot finally took a step forward. His expression was unreadable, but something in his eyes made the hallway feel smaller. He stopped a few feet away and looked from me to Laura, assessing her, the way someone examines a lock before deciding whether to pick it. "Richard," he said softly, "I need a word." Laura shifted closer to me, protective, but also trying to understand what was happening. Elliot's gaze dropped to the key ring on my belt, just for a second, then lifted again. "You didn't stay where I told you," he said. The reprimand in his voice struck me hard, too hard, considering I didn't owe him anything. But the way he said it, low and certain, made my pulse spike. "I went where I needed to," I replied. His jaw tightened, and someone went where they shouldn't have. Laura's eyes widened slightly. "What is he talking about?" Before I could answer, Elliot turned and walked a few steps down the hall, stopping exactly where the lighting shifted into shadow. "Richard," he said without looking back, "if you want to understand what's happening, you need to come with me. Now." Laura touched my arm. "Don't go with him." But Elliot finally glanced over his shoulder, and the look he gave me wasn't threatening. It was triumphant, like the day had unfolded exactly the way he intended. I didn't move at first. Neither did Laura. Elliot stood at the far end of the hallway, half-shadowed, as if the building had drawn a line between us. His presence alone made the silence feel heavier. Even though his voice had been soft, it carried through the corridor with a certainty that left no room for misunderstanding. "Richard," he repeated gently, "come with me." The invitation didn't sound like a choice. Laura's grip tightened on my arm. "Don't," she whispered. "Something's not right with him." She was right, of course. Nothing about Elliot had been right since the moment he appeared that morning. But the problem was that everything he predicted, every little detail, had unfolded exactly the way he said it would. Not dramatic events, not supernatural miracles, just small truths. Things that settled under my skin in a way I couldn't shake. "I need answers," I said quietly. Laura's eyes softened with worry. "And you think you'll get them from him?" I didn't. Not really, but standing still felt worse than following him, like letting the day keep twisting without understanding why. "I'll be back," I said. Laura didn't believe me, but she nodded anyway. Not agreement, resignation. I stepped toward Elliot. With each footfall, the space between us felt more like a slope pulling me forward. He waited, patient, unreadable. When I finally reached him, he glanced at Laura before turning and walking deeper into the dim wing. "Not here," he murmured. "People listen." We passed the bulletin boards, the old radiator with peeling paint, the staff coat hooks. The building's long winter creaks followed us, settling into place with each shift of the heating pipes. Elliot didn't look back to see if I was following because he already knew I was. He moved with the same quiet certainty he always had, like every step of mine was already mapped. He stopped near a small meeting room, pushed the door open, and gestured inside. "We can talk here." The room smelled of dust and old coffee. Folded chairs lined the wall, and a single table sat in the center, its surface scratched by decades of community events. Elliot closed the door gently behind us. "You were supposed to stay in the West Wing," he said. My jaw clenched. "You can't keep ordering me around without explaining anything." He nodded slightly, as if he expected my frustration. "I know, but you need to understand that timing matters. If you're in the wrong place at the wrong moment, people make assumptions, and those assumptions spread." "And whose fault is that?" I snapped. "You won't tell me what's actually happening." His eyes softened, not with sympathy, but with something closer to calculation. "Richard, sometimes knowing the full truth makes people act differently, and I can't have you acting differently today." That chilled me. "Why? What are you planning?" He didn't answer. He stepped to the side, placing himself between me and the door, not blocking it, just standing where he controlled the space. "Listen to me carefully. Something was taken from the basement storage. Something small, but important. And when people realize it's missing, they'll look for someone to blame." My stomach twisted. "You took it." He held my gaze, steady, unflinching. "Does it matter who took it? What matters is who was seen near the door. Who held the key? Who refused access? Who looked suspicious?" Pieces of the day slid into place with sickening clarity. "You set me up," I whispered. His expression didn't change. "I positioned you where you needed to be." "For what?" My voice cracked. "Why me?" "Because you listened," he said simply. "Because you trust easily. Because you didn't tell anyone I existed." The room seemed to shrink around us. I felt my heartbeat in my throat. He took a single step closer. "When people ask what happened, they'll remember your behavior today. They'll remember the locked door, your refusal, your nerves, your lies. Not mine." My breath came shallow. "Why do this? What did you even take?" He didn't blink. "Something that isn't valuable to you. Something that doesn't matter in your timeline. But in mine." He let the sentence linger, unfinished, as if the rest was too heavy to say, or too dangerous. Then he walked past me and opened the door, his voice calm again. "You have a choice now. Stay quiet, and the day will pass the way it needs to. Or try to fix it and make the blame fall faster." I stood frozen, watching him step back into the hallway with the same quiet confidence he'd had since morning. The truth was finally clear. Elliot didn't come to protect me. He came to disappear and leave me standing in the space where he'd been. I didn't follow Elliot out of the room right away. I stood there, gripping the edge of the worn table, trying to steady the shaking in my hands. Everything he'd said echoed through me in loops. Timing matters. People make assumptions. You listened. You trust easily. Words meant to sound like caution, but now they revealed exactly what they were. The script of someone who'd built the day around me like a trap. I stepped into the hallway, but Elliot was already gone. Not just gone, vanished into the quiet of the building so completely. It made me question whether he'd been there at all. The shadows in the corridor felt heavier, as if the pipes and panels were absorbing everything I didn't understand. I walked toward the lobby. My legs felt unsteady, like they didn't belong to me. When I reached the corner near the bulletin board, I heard voices, soft but tense. Laura's voice, and another, more abrupt. "Brian." Relief hit me for a moment, then twisted into dread just as fast. I turned the corner and saw them standing near the front desk. Laura was holding the stack of envelopes she'd carried earlier, her posture tight. Brian stood opposite her, arms crossed, brows pulled together. He didn't look angry, yet, but he looked concerned enough to make my stomach drop. They both turned when they heard my steps. "There he is," Brian said. The way he said it wasn't hostile. It was factual. But the fact alone carried weight. "Richard," he continued, "we need to talk." Laura didn't hide the worry in her eyes. It was fuller now, rooted deeper. The basement, the strange noises, the missing item, all of it was gathering around me like a storm cloud. I forced myself to keep my expression neutral. "What's going on?" Brian held up a clipboard with a sheet attached. "The inventory log. Something's missing from basement storage." My throat tightened. "What?" "I'll get to that," he said. "But first, why were you down there earlier?" It was the way he asked. Not aggressive, not defensive, just direct in a way that made me feel cornered, because there wasn't a single answer I could give that wouldn't sound strange. Laura glanced at me, searching for something in my face, something honest, something steady. I wished I could give her that. "I was checking a few things," I said. "The boiler readings, the vents." "That's not what Laura said," Brian replied. My stomach dropped lower. Laura spoke quietly. "I didn't mean it like that. I just said you weren't acting like yourself." Brian studied me more carefully now. "Richard, the item that's missing, it was in a drawer that only staff with keys can access." I felt a cold pulse crawl up my spine. Elliot hadn't just used me as a shield. He'd used my access, my routine, my trust from others. He'd slipped through the building while I was busy following his warnings and second-guessing myself. "What item?" I asked, though part of me already feared the answer didn't matter. Missing was missing. Brian lifted the clipboard again. Several community documents. Nothing valuable in the sense of money, but important. Sign-in sheets, archive notes, early planning drafts for city proposals. Things we track carefully. Laura added softly. "We found the drawer open. And the basement lock." I closed my eyes briefly. "You heard it too." "Yes," she said. "But you were the only one down there at the time." Brian's voice was level but firm. "Richard, I'm not accusing you, but we need to understand what happened. Someone accessed those records and the timeline points to the hours you were in and out of that area. It would have been so easy to say the truth. A man from the future told me not to let anyone into the basement. He predicted small things to earn my trust. He moved through the building behind me, slipping into places while I stayed in others. He staged the day so I would look guilty, but spoken out loud it would sound like a breakdown, like paranoia, like desperation. So I said nothing. Brian let the silence stretch before speaking again. "Richard, if you saw anything unusual, anything at all, you need to tell me." My voice felt trapped somewhere behind my ribs. I'm not sure what I saw, and it was true, because I didn't see Elliot take anything. I only saw the space he left behind. Laura stepped slightly closer. "Richard, please, just tell us." A faint tremor ran through my hands again. Elliot had vanished. The missing documents had not. The blame had a shape now, one that fit over me like a shadow. And I finally understood why Elliot's eyes looked triumphant earlier. The day wasn't spiraling because I did something wrong. It was spiraling because he planned for it too. Brian motioned for us to move into the small conference room beside the lobby, the same one where staff held morning check-ins or winter event planning sessions. I had been in that room hundreds of times, but stepping inside now felt different. The walls seemed closer, the air heavier. Laura sat near the end of the long table while Brian closed the door behind us. "Richard," he said, pulling out a chair for himself, "I need you to walk me through everything you did today, step by step." I sat slowly, my hands clasped together to keep them from shaking. "I came in at the usual time, checked the vents, looked at the boiler readings. That's not what I mean," Brian interrupted gently but firmly. "I need to know who you talked to, where you went, anything out of the ordinary." My throat tightened. Most of what was out of the ordinary couldn't be explained, not in a way that would make sense, not in a way that would help me. Laura leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Richard, just tell us. We're not here to accuse you, but something isn't right, and the longer we avoid it, the worse it will look." Her words hurt more than if she had raised her voice. She sounded like someone trying to save me from myself, and I didn't want her carrying the weight of my silence. "I talked to someone outside this morning," I said quietly. They both looked at me, waiting. "Who?" Brian asked. I swallowed. "A man. He knew things about me he shouldn't. Details about my past. About this building. He warned me that something would happen today." Brian's brows pulled together. "Warned you?" "Yes." Laura's voice softened. "Richard, what exactly did he say?" I hesitated. The truth came to the surface like a bruise, tender and ugly. He told me not to give the basement key to anyone, that if I did, I'd get blamed for something. Brian exchanged a quick glance with Laura. Not hostile, not dismissive, just concerned. Did you know him? Brian asked. No. What's his name? Elliot, I said, the name leaving my tongue like a stone sinking in water. Brian sat back in his chair. And you trusted this, Elliot? The way he said it wasn't mocking. It was weary, like he already feared the answer. I didn't trust him, I said. He knew things, small things I never mentioned, and he predicted something that happened minutes later. A light flickered exactly when he said it would. I paused. He wasn't guessing. Silence followed. The kind of silence that makes you aware of every breath in the room. Laura spoke first. Richard, do you think this man could have taken the documents? Her voice wasn't accusing, but hope flickered behind it. Hope that there was an explanation other than me. He was near the basement, I said, more than once. He knew where I'd be. He knew when Laura would come looking. He kept steering me away from certain places. My voice wavered. I think he planned this. Brian rubbed a hand over his forehead. Richard, why would someone go through all this trouble? Why pick you? Why today? What would he gain? I had no answer. I only had Elliot's calm voice echoing behind my ears. You trust easily. Brian leaned forward. Tell me exactly where you saw him last. He was in the hallway outside the West Wing, I said. A few minutes before I checked the basement again. And now? Gone. Brian exhaled slowly, the skepticism finally surfacing in his expression. Richard, I'm not saying you're lying, I'm not. But this story is unusual. I felt something inside me sink, heavy and slow. Laura reached out, placing her fingertips lightly on the table near mine. Not touching, just close enough to ground me. We don't think you're making it up, she said softly. But it's hard. You're asking us to believe someone slipped past us, predicted things, and disappeared without a trace. He did, I whispered. Brian's voice stayed calm. We'll check the building again, every room, every hall. If this Elliot is here, we'll find him. But Richard, he hesitated. If we don't find anyone, this conversation gets harder. I looked down at the table, the worn scratches, the tiny dents, the faint ring marks left by a cup from some long-forgotten meeting. All the normal things that made up this place, this life. Normal things Elliot had slipped through like smoke. Brian stood, signaling the conversation was over for now. Stay nearby. I'll be back. Laura lingered, looking at me with an ache in her eyes. Richard, I'm trying to help. I nodded, but it felt like my head weighed too much, because I finally understood something. Elliot didn't just plan for me to look suspicious. He planned for me to sound unbelievable. Brian left the room first. His footsteps moved down the hall with purpose, but not urgency. He wasn't rushing to find Elliot. He was checking the building because he had to, because protocol demanded it, because I had said something that couldn't be ignored. But I could tell by the sound of his steps that he didn't expect to find anyone. Laura stayed behind for a moment, still seated, still watching me the way you watch something fragile, carefully, afraid to make it worse. Richard, she said quietly, if this man is real, we'll find him. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe anyone could find Elliot. But he moved through the building like he'd memorized every shift in air, every blind spot in the hallways, every second people turned away. Time wasn't his only advantage. He knew how people behaved. I'm not making this up, I said. I know you're not lying, she replied. I can see that, but that doesn't mean everything happened the way you think. Her words didn't come from doubt, they came from kindness, and somehow that made them hit harder. She stood and placed a hand lightly on the back of my chair, not touching me, just steadying herself. Wait here, I'll help Brian search. I nodded, unable to meet her eyes. She left the room quietly, closing the door behind her. For a long moment I sat alone in the stale air of the conference room, listening to the faint hum of the lights above me. My pulse thudded in my ears. Every breath felt heavy, like the building itself was pushing down on my lungs. I took a shaky exhale and stood, pacing slowly around the table. The truth was simple. I had no idea what Elliot truly wanted, only that he wanted me in the center of the fallout. I didn't want to sit still, but I also didn't want to run. Movement felt dangerous. Stillness felt worse. So I stepped into the hallway and leaned against the wall, pressing my palms into the cool paint. Somewhere in the building, a door shut softly. Then voices. Brian's, low and even, and Laura's, anxious. They were searching rooms, calling out, checking corners. The building wasn't large, but its hallways folded in ways that made sound travel unpredictably. Sometimes their voices were close, sometimes distant, but they never sounded surprised. They never sounded like they'd found someone. I walked toward the lobby, drawn by the faint sound of wind from the front entrance. The glass doors were fogged near the bottom from winter air meeting indoor heat. Outside, the pale afternoon light cast long shadows across the snow. For a moment, the view looked peaceful. But then I noticed something. Near the coat rack to my right, one of the hooks hung slightly crooked. Not broken, just angled differently than the others. A coat had been there recently. Someone had taken it down quickly. Someone leaving quietly. My throat tightened. I stepped closer, and the faint smell of cold air touched my nose. Fresh, recent. Whoever stood there hadn't left long ago. And then I saw it. On the floor, half hidden beneath the bench, lay a small, folded paper, the kind of scrap someone might tuck into a pocket or slip into a drawer. I bent down and picked it up, feeling the slight warmth still trapped in the creases. My hands shook as I opened it. There was only one line written inside in small, careful handwriting. Don't follow. No signature. No explanation. But I didn't need either. Elliot had been here. Minutes ago. Close enough to leave this behind. Close enough to watch. A cold feeling seeped into my chest. He wasn't running from me. He was controlling the distance. Controlling when I saw him, when I didn't. When I felt alone. When I felt cornered. And now he wanted me to stay exactly where I was. I stood there holding the note, feeling the building shift around me in ways I couldn't describe. Each sound amplified, each empty corner suspicious. Footsteps approached from down the hall. Laura appeared first, then Brian behind her. Her eyes immediately dropped to the paper in my hand. What's that? I swallowed hard. He left it. Brian reached for it slowly, reading the line with a frown. Who? Elliot? Yes. He studied me, then the note again. Richard, where did you find this? By the entrance. He was here. Brian let out a long breath, the kind people release when they're standing at the edge of believing something they don't want to acknowledge. But Laura's expression changed first. It wasn't disbelief. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. Like she suddenly understood just how deep I was already falling into Elliot's plan. Laura's expression wasn't loud or dramatic. It shifted in a small, precise way, like a puzzle piece sliding into place. She looked from the note to me, then back to the front entrance, and her eyes softened with something between fear and understanding. Richard, she whispered. Someone was watching us. Brian took the note from my hand again, tracing the letters with his thumb. You're sure this is from him? Yes, I said. He knew exactly where we'd end up. He knew when to step out and when to disappear. Brian exhaled slowly, the sound thin and tired. All right, let's assume for a moment that this Elliot exists exactly the way you describe him. Why leave a note? Why warn you not to follow? He didn't want me to see where he was going, I said. Or what he was taking, Laura added quietly. The hallway felt colder. Not physically, emotionally. Like the building itself was withdrawing from me, pulling its warmth into corners I couldn't reach. My hands were shaking again, and Laura noticed. She rested her palm lightly against my forearm. Not quite a touch, just support close enough to feel. You're not okay, she murmured. I didn't deny it. I didn't have the strength to. Brian walked toward the entrance and inspected the floor near the coat rack, crouching to look closely at the small scuffs in the salt-dusted tile. These tracks are fresh, he said. Someone walked in from outside after the last cleaning. And recently. I closed my eyes for a moment. Elliot had been here, not just this morning, not just somewhere in the building. He had been right behind me, right in the spaces I left open. Every corridor I avoided, he used. Every minute I hesitated, he advanced. Every warning he gave me was another way to move me into position. Laura's voice broke through my thoughts. Richard, what exactly did he say to you? Word for word. I steadied myself and repeated it softly. He said people would blame me for something I didn't do, that the key would make everything fall on me, and that if I followed his advice, I'd avoid the worst of it. Brian straightened, eyes narrowing. So he played you? Yes, I whispered. But why you? Laura asked. The question felt like it pulled the air out of my lungs. Because I listened. Because he predicted small things I couldn't ignore. Because he gave me just enough truth to anchor the lies. And because I let him. I don't know, I said. I don't know what he took or why he needed me in the way. Brian rubbed his forehead. He used your access, your routine. People trust you here. That gives someone a lot of cover. The truth landed heavier than anything Elliot had said. He didn't choose me because I was vulnerable. He chose me because I was reliable, predictable, someone whose presence didn't alarm anyone. Laura stepped beside Brian. We need to check the storage room again. The drawer he opened, it wasn't random. She looked at me then. Come with us. Something inside me recoiled. Not because I didn't want to help, but because every step I took felt like I was walking deeper into Elliot's design. He had planned the day around my choices, my reactions, my presence near the basement. But staying behind would be worse. It would look like guilt, like avoidance. So I nodded. We walked together down the hallway, our footsteps echoing softly. Laura stayed close to me, not touching, but near enough to give me a sense of warmth in the freezing quiet. Brian walked ahead, keys jingling in his hand, a sound that should have comforted me, but instead twisted in my chest. Halfway to the basement, I slowed. Laura noticed. Richard, the building was too quiet, the kind of quiet that felt arranged. At the far end of the corridor, a shadow slipped out of sight. Not fast, not startled. Calm, measured, like someone walking around a corner they'd used many times before. I inhaled sharply. Elliot, or the echo of him. Brian turned. Richard? I pointed. There, down the hall. But when he looked, the shadow was gone. Just an empty stretch of dull hallway and the faint hum of heating pipes. Brian shook his head. No one's there. But Laura's eyes stayed on me, and something in her expression said she believed that I had seen exactly who I said I saw. Just too late to prove he was ever real. We reached the basement door again, but this time, the weight of everything that had happened followed us down the stairwell like a second shadow. Brian went first, flicking on the lights with a sharp snap that echoed against the concrete walls. Laura walked behind him, and I stayed at the rear, feeling like the building was closing around me inch by inch. The basement looked the same as before, rows of shelves, boxes, the faint smell of cardboard and old air. But something new lingered in the atmosphere, a sort of uneasy stillness, a pause that felt too long. Brian reached the drawer that had been disturbed earlier. He pulled it open completely and crouched down, scanning its contents with practiced precision. The missing items aren't large, he said, but they're important. Laura knelt beside him. What exactly was here? Early project proposals, Brian said. Community records, dates, signatures. He tapped the empty space where the object had been. If someone wanted to disrupt upcoming approvals or erase a paper trail, this would be the place to start. Laura looked at me, not accusing, just searching, hopeful that I knew something that could help. I didn't. I stepped forward and crouched beside them. The drawer's emptiness looked worse up close, like someone had scooped out the one thing that held everything together. I brushed my hand lightly across the shelf. The dust patterns were uneven, subtle enough that most people wouldn't notice. But I wasn't most people today. I'd spent the whole day watching for the small details, the ones Elliot had trained me to see. He took something thin, I murmured. Paper, or a folder, something he could keep flat. Brian nodded grimly. And he did it while you were nearby. The implication hit me like a slow punch. Elliot hadn't just used the building's blind spots. He used mine. Every moment he distracted me, every conversation, every warning, had been timed to give him the opening he needed. A cold prickle spread across my arms. He waited for me to be in this hallway, I whispered. He knew when Laura would ask for the key. He knew when Brian wouldn't be here. He timed the whole morning, Laura said softly. Brian stood up. We need to review camera footage. I blinked. Camera footage? He nodded. Only in a few areas. Not the basement, unfortunately. We never got the funding for full coverage. But the entrance, West Wing halls, and the lobby have feeds. A small flicker of hope lit inside me. For the first time since morning, the idea of proof didn't feel so impossible. Brian walked toward the stairs. Come on. But as we reached the bottom step, something stopped me. A faint mark on the underside of the stair railing. A smudge. Barely visible unless you were at the right angle. Laura noticed me hesitating. "Richard?" I traced the mark carefully with my thumb. It was a light streak of dirt or salt, something from outside. Someone had gripped the railing here. Someone who shouldn't have been in this hallway at all. Someone who had been very, very careful. My breath caught. "He came down here more than once." Laura's voice lowered. "Are you sure?" "Yes." Brian paused halfway up the stairs. "Richard, what are you seeing?" "He wasn't rushing," I said. "He moved calmly. He planned every step he took." Brian looked skeptical, but Laura didn't. She whispered, "He was watching you." I nodded, because that was the truth I struggled to admit even to myself. Elliot hadn't simply outsmarted me. He'd anticipated me. We followed Brian up the stairs, and the lights above us flickered again. The same flicker Elliot predicted that morning. Except now it didn't feel like coincidence or proof. It felt like a reminder. A reminder that he'd been right about the small things because he'd arranged the big ones. When we reached the lobby, Brian headed straight for the small security room near the entrance. The hum of old desktops and the grainy glow of monitors filled the cramped space. He pulled up footage from the morning hours. Laura and I stood behind him, and the moment the screen loaded, my stomach dropped. There I was, entering the building at 8:02 a.m., just as always, walking through the lobby, hanging up my coat, reaching for the maintenance log. But there was something else, something that made my breath stop. Just seconds after I walked out of frame, Elliot stepped into it. And he wasn't hidden. He wasn't blurred. He wasn't a trick of memory. He was right there, clear as day, walking calmly through the lobby, hands in his pockets, looking directly at the camera, as if he wanted to be seen. The footage played in silence, but the room felt loud, too loud, with the hum of old electronics, the faint buzz in the lights, and the thud of my heart pounding behind my ribs. Brian leaned forward, elbows braced on the desk, staring at the monitor as if blinking would make the image vanish. But it didn't. Elliot moved through the lobby with calm certainty, just minutes after I had. He didn't look rushed, didn't look lost. He walked with the ease of someone who knew exactly where he was going, and exactly how long he had to get there. Laura brought a hand to her mouth. "Richard, that's him." I didn't answer. My voice felt pinned inside my chest. It wasn't just that Elliot appeared on the footage, it was the way he appeared. He looked straight at the camera, not accidentally, not glancing, directly, holding eye contact for a few seconds, as if he wanted the record to show he was real, as if he wanted me to know that he had allowed himself to be seen. Brian rewound the footage and played it again, slower this time. "You said he talked to you outside," Brian murmured, eyes narrowed. "When is this compared to that?" "About 10 minutes later." Laura turned to me. "Did he say anything then? Anything else?" I shook my head. "He didn't approach me inside. Not then. I didn't see him come in." "Which means he came in right after you," Brian said, "and didn't want you to notice." That truth sank slowly, like sediment settling in water. Brian fast-forwarded. Elliot crossed the lobby, past the front desk, and walked into the west hallway. No hesitation, no pause to look around. He had memorized the building on his first pass, or had known it long before today. Then Brian froze the frame. "There," he said, pointing. "Look at his hand." Elliot's coat sleeve shifted just enough to reveal something thin tucked under his arm. A folder, not large, not bulky, the kind that could fit discreetly inside a jacket. Laura whispered, That could be one of the documents." Brian didn't respond right away. He zoomed in, but the footage was too grainy to confirm. It was just a blur of pale shape, but the timing told enough of the story. Elliot had the folder before anyone knew something was missing, and I was the only one who had interacted with him. Brian leaned back, rubbing both hands over his face. "Okay, we have a visitor who wasn't logged in, who knew where to go, who left no record of entry, and who's now missing." Laura looked at me with both worry and relief on her face. "Richard, this helps you. For now," Brian added. "But we still need to find him. The footage shows he walked toward the West Hall. After that, he's not on any other camera. That means," I said quietly, "he used the blind spots." Brian nodded. He knew where they were. Laura touched my arm gently. "Richard, you were right." The words hit harder than I expected, not because they freed me, but because they made the day feel suddenly heavier. Being right didn't undo the damage Elliot had caused. It didn't return the missing documents. It didn't explain his motives. Brian stood abruptly. "We need to check the exits." We followed him out. The hallway felt even colder now. Winter air seeped through the front doors, leaving thin drafts curling along the floor. We checked the side entrance, then the back, the one used for deliveries and after-hours staff. When Brian unlocked it, a rush of cold air swept in. Outside, the snow was disturbed, boot prints leading away into the narrow alley behind the building. Not many, just a few steps before they blended into the street where others had walked earlier. But the first few prints were clear. They matched Elliot's shoes from the footage. "He left on foot," Brian said. "Not long ago." Laura stepped beside me. "He didn't want to be caught." "No," I said, voice quiet. "He wanted me to be." The words came out before I could stop them, because it was true. Elliot hadn't run because he feared being found. He'd run because he'd already gotten what he wanted. He had taken something small but important, and left me standing in the perfect position for blame. Brian closed the door, locking it behind us. "We're calling the city office. We need to report a breach and missing documents. And we'll need your statement, Richard. Both of yours." Laura placed a hand lightly on my back. Supportive. Steady. "We'll tell them what we saw. You won't be alone in this." But I didn't feel reassured. Because as we walked back through the dim lobby, I saw something on the floor near the vending machine. A faint piece of torn paper. I bent down and picked it up. Just 2 words were written. "Not done." My hand went cold. Elliot was still in control of the day, still shaping it, still writing the script long after he'd walked away. And somehow I knew, whatever he set in motion wasn't over, not even close. I stayed late that evening, long after Brian finished filing his report, long after Laura went home, pausing at the door to ask if I needed anything before she left. I told her I was fine, though the word felt brittle in my mouth. The building emptied slowly, the way it always did during winter, one door shutting at a time, one light clicking off, the air settling into quieter layers. When the last footsteps faded, the silence didn't comfort me. It pressed against my shoulders like a weight. I walked toward the lobby again, passing the same coat rack, the same bulletin boards, the same uneven tile where the snow had melted around the edges. Everything looked normal, entirely normal, as if nothing unusual had ever happened today. Except I knew better. I reached into my pocket and unfolded the scrap of paper I'd found near the vending machine. The 2 words, "Not done," sat there like a warning that refused to fade. I didn't know when he had written it. I didn't know when he had left it. All I knew was that Elliot had moved through this place with a kind of certainty no ordinary person should have. He knew when to appear. He knew when to disappear. He knew how to shape a day so cleanly around someone else that the pieces fit without anyone noticing the gaps. And the worst part was realizing that even with the footage, even with proof he existed, his absence felt louder than his presence. I locked up the building, stepped out into the cold evening air, and stood there for a moment, watching my breath drift upward. Somewhere in the quiet of the street, I felt the subtle echo of his voice. The first thing he ever said to me, "What matters isn't who I am, it's what's about to happen to you." I just didn't know he meant after he was gone. And I still don't know how much of the future he had already decided for me.